Why Māori don't vote. When non-voting is not a choice but a consequence. Article by Kaimatara. I didn't vote last election. Now I know for some the knee-jerk reaction to this would be, well, you're the reason National won the last election. Hope you're happy. The thing is, it wasn't a conscious choice. I was in hospital during the last election cycle. Over the last few years, my health has decreased dramatically. Despite this, I get treated mostly with apathy by the health system, leading to my health deteriorating at an increasing rate. And I'm not the only one either. This is a systemic issue disproportionately affecting Māori. As pointed out on this video by Alice Snedden, one of the things mentioned were, some research has been done about if you turn up at A&E with the symptoms of a heart attack, and you're Māori and non-Māori, you'll get offered different treatment. The Pākehā person will be offered the more expensive and more aggressive treatment. Another was, every week there would be a tangi, or a preventable death, from somebody that didn't need to die if the health sector had been more responsive to the needs of Māori. The neglect that Māori suffer through leads to this disparity, leading to a life expectancy of 7 years less than Pākehā, and in some places like the far north it was a 15-year life expectancy gap. I bring this up because, as you can see, my non-voting was not a moral choice but a consequence. A consequence of a system that devalues Māori life. What people mistake for apathy or irresponsibility is in fact structural disenfranchisement through neglect. Part 1. Our deeply democratic history shows something is seriously wrong with the system today. In the 1800s, early settlers were astounded by early Māori democracy, as pointed out by Anne Salmond in Anne Salmond, Te Tiriti and Democracy. Part 4. Unite and Rule. People like Judge Francis Dart Fenton would say things like, no system of government that the world ever saw can be more democratic than that of the Maoris. The chief alone has no power. The whole tribe deliberate on every subject, not only politically on such as are of public interest, but even judicially they hold their committees on every private quarrel. In ordinary times the vox populi determines every matter, both internal and external. No individual enjoys influence or exercises power unless it originates with the mass and is expressly or tacitly conferred by them. As noted by this blog post by The Meeting Place, a New Zealand history blog, these settlers also felt threatened by this radical democracy, with lawyer and politician John Gorst saying with scathing frustration, the name Runanga was used by the Maoris to denote assemblies of a particular kind, which were in use before ever Europeans came into the country. The Runanga was a sort of council of war, held in wartime to discuss war questions. It was formed of the highest chiefs, but inferior men were not excluded, though the reverence then paid to the chiefs forbade the rest to take any prominent part in the discussions. As time went on, the Runanga began to take notice of other matters and to grow more and more democratic, until it degenerated into a promiscuous gathering of men, women and children, which usurped the whole legislative and judicial function of government. Why would such a historically democratic people, indeed the most democratic people according to some, disproportionately not participate in our current democracy? Part 2. The Westminster system is to democracy what capitalism is to the commons. In its early days, capitalism gained its foothold through the state-sanctioned enclosure of common land, enabled and formalized through the Westminster parliamentary system, which dispossessed peasants and transformed the commons into private property. Enclosure drove peasants off shared land, stripped their food security, and forced them into wage labor. Communities fragmented, poverty deepened, and lives shortened. These are all things we Māori disproportionately suffer through today. The parallels are stark. Just as enclosure turned shared land into private property, The Westminster system turned shared governance into representative politics. Where once our voice directly and constantly mattered, we are now relegated to choose between pre-selected rulers every few years. And when you enclose democracy, you enclose care. The same logic that fences off power fences off healthcare and well-being. This is why Maori democracy was seen as a threat. Capitalism is not another form of the commons, just as the Westminster system is not another form of democracy. They are enclosures of them. What liberals call apathy, then, is not apathy, but fear. It is our ancestral nervous system saying, beware of enclosure. Part 3. Representation for who? Rebuttals from people might be, well, you should vote anyway, so you can actually get representation. I want you to consider how great combination of representatives this sounds. One was a single Māori mother who lived in poverty on the benefit, the other lived in a state house. They'd definitely be good at representing you, right? Except this was Paula Bennett and John Key. Okay, if not representation, it must be ideological alignment, right? At least that is good. Well, there was someone who was pro-Māori, took part in the Bastion Point protest, was disgusted by Don Brash's Orewa speech, and joined Labour. Another was a member of the Ngāti Wailand Retention Committee with Dame Fina Cooper. Yet another joined the Green Party when it was newly formed and became the country's first Green councillor. Except the first was Shane Jones, the second was Winston Peters, and the third was Stephen Rainbow. Why would ex-Labour and Green members and marginalised people betray the very people and groups they should be representing? This happens not because there are some bad apples in Parliament, but because representation is limited by class position. By the very existence of their class status, politicians inherently represent that class. Because when they become politicians, they derive income from administering the state, not from selling their labour power like the working class do. This doesn't mean most politicians are cartoon villains or consciously against the poor. It just means their structural incentives align with the reproduction of existing class relations, not their abolition. Part 4. Propaganda and Paternalism. Conservatives love propaganda. The most effective of these are blaming systemic inequalities on individual failings, a logic that blames poverty on laziness, illness on lifestyle, etc. This is one, when it comes to voting, that white liberals fall hook, line and sinker for, while perpetuating the other thing the system relies on, racism. Instead of focusing on the lack of outcomes for Māori, liberals often try to blame the disproportionately low voting rates on propaganda, saying things like, "It is not because nothing will change for Māori, it is because Māori are manipulated not to vote." Firstly, this is paternalistic nonsense, because if this were solely the case, it would imply that because white people disproportionately vote more, they are less gullible to propaganda, a very racist assumption. Even without invoking gullibility, this argument assumes Maori behavior is primarily shaped by messaging and not material conditions, abstracting Maori from the historical and social contexts that actually explain voting patterns, reducing our agency to a reactive function of external influence, which is a subtle form of racialization. It's far more likely that it's not that Maori are systematically propagandized into non-voting by conservatives. That idea doesn't match historical or sociological evidence. Maori non-participation in formal politics instead correlates with material conditions, poverty, poor health, geographic marginalization, systemic distrust, the very conditions perpetuated by the system itself, as mentioned earlier. It makes more sense, then, that it's not that Maori are propagandized by conservatives not to vote, but more likely that white liberals are propagandized by conservatives to see Maori non-voting as a moral failure, or worse, a cultural flaw rather than a consequence of systemic neglect. Part 5. You already know we are unequal. For white liberals to believe that voting has any significant material change for us as much as it does for them is to believe that Māori are already on equal footing with them. However, if that were true, then one would have to argue that Hobson's pledge are right, that Māori wards and Māori seats and the Māori role are not needed and are unfair, something most liberals would disagree with. One could argue that is exactly why we have Māori seats, wards and role, mechanisms designed to correct the imbalance and give our vote equal value. But this runs into another contradiction. These mechanisms are under constant attack and are perpetually contested, as evidenced by groups like Hobson's Pledge, who lobby for their removal. This creates a political reality where we are forced to constantly defend the tools for our own basic representation, rather than having any power to use those tools to advance our interests, such as better healthcare for Māori. The fight for survival of the mechanism drains energy from the fight for its purpose. As I mentioned in my White Allies Don't Exist article, in a system of white supremacy, Black and Indigenous people are in a position where neither avoiding violence nor using violence guarantees safety or justice. Peaceful behavior doesn't protect, and violent resistance doesn't make things worse in a straightforward way, because the system is inherently violent and punitive toward Black and Indigenous life. The same goes for voting. For the most impoverished and marginalized of us, neither avoiding voting nor voting guarantees safety or justice. Voting doesn't protect, and non-voting doesn't make things worse in a straightforward way, because the system was not created with us in mind. Part 6. Throw me a lifeline. My circumstances did not get worse under National. No, I am not a landlord, nor do I work for the tobacco industry. It wasn't because of anything National is doing, not by a long shot. It's because as a queer disabled Maori living in poverty, nothing significant materially gets better for me under any government, including Labour. There is very little for me to lose. I am, and have been, simply out here surviving. While a Pākehā voter or politician can focus their political energy on advancing an agenda, a disproportionate amount of Maori political energy must be spent on defending the very structures that allow for a Maori voice. This is a drain on material and even emotional resources that white institutions never have to face. After all, you can't win a race if you're constantly having to rebuild your own lane. The value of a vote isn't in the act of casting it. It's in the certainty that the system will respond to your group's needs. For the white liberal majority, this is a given. For us Maori, on the other hand, even when we win small concessions, those concessions are often the first on the chopping block. This inherent precarity makes our vote less valuable because its outcomes are less secure. The Maori vote, therefore, is often like a piece of driftwood in a flood. The driftwood is not something you steer. You are at the mercy of the currents. Agency is reduced to desperate survival. The driftwood doesn't end the flood, and it doesn't get you to dry land. Hell, it barely keeps you afloat. Your fundamental situation, being in the hostile flood, remains unchanged. This puts us Maori in a perpetual state of survival, and survival mode has measurable physiological and psychological consequences. Chronic activation of the stress response. Constant threats to material well-being keep the body in a state of high cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this leads to allostatic load, the wear and tear on organs, brain, and immune system caused by chronic stress. Studies link high allostatic load to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and premature mortality. This is one of the factors affecting me the most. Impaired cognitive function. Research shows that chronic stress impairs executive function, decision-making, and working memory. This explains why long-term survival pressures reduce bandwidth for abstract political participation, planning, or activism. A more direct cause of non-voting: heightened risk of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Persistent exposure to structural violence and marginalization produces trauma-like responses, even without a single acute event. Studies on populations under chronic social stress show higher rates of mood disorders, suicidal ideation, and self-harm. Maori suicide rates are roughly 80% higher than all non-Maori combined. Intergenerational stress transmission. Epigenetic research has shown that chronic stress in one generation can alter gene expression in the next, meaning it can predispose descendants to heightened stress reactivity and coping challenges. This compounds historical trauma and colonial dispossession. This is akin to the ancestral nervous system mentioned earlier. People often respond to Maori non-voting with guilt-tripping rhetoric, but their guilt-tripping does not mitigate the stress, it compounds it. By framing survival-based disengagement as a personal failing rather than a predictable response to systemic oppression, liberal moralism adds shame and emotional strain to an already precarious mental or physical state. This creates and perpetuates a vicious cycle. Survival mode voting requires emotional labor. Emotional labor compounds chronic stress. Chronic stress elevates worsening health outcomes, suicide risk, and of course, further disengagement. Non-voting, then, is not a moral failing, but rather a scientifically and socially predictable response to a system that structurally devalues Maori lives. Part 7. A striking resemblance. Another flaw in the guilt-tripping strategy is it comes across as hypocrisy. When they say, well, not voting just makes things worse, they often overlook that they are functioning on the very same logic that bad faith actors like Simeon Brown act on with striking. Liberals often support strikes, even though they can cause real harm to ordinary people, like patients such as myself. But that harm reveals the system's fragility and neglect, not the workers' selfishness. When hospitals are understaffed, when nurses and doctors refuse to participate, liberals support this because they recognize that this is a necessary consequence of an unjust structure. Simeon Brown is correct. I just threw up in my mouth a little having to say that. Refusing to participate in work does harm patients, but that is a consequence of the system he upholds, not of those who are refusing to participate in it. Yet these liberals who will rightly explain to Simeon that the unjust system he upholds, leading to the underpaying, stress and lower mental and physical health for nurses and doctors, is the reason why they are refusing to participate, are the same who shame people who don't vote, even though many Maori non-voters are making the same point. The system isn't responsive to me, and my participation just perpetuates it. Some people have floated the idea of making voting compulsory, but this will not fix the non-voting issue. In fact, it would make these systemic inequalities worse, because what punishments would happen but ones that once again disproportionately target Maori? The threat of compulsory voting would not influence Maori to vote because the systemic inequalities still exist, and the punishments would just make inequalities worse. This strategy would only push Maori further into financial precarity, stress, and lowering mental and physical health outcomes, leading to more alienation and disengagement. This will not fix the disproportionate systemic issues, just as Simeon Brown, considering a law change to crack down on striking healthcare workers, will not fix the injustices that the health workers experience. These actions just exacerbate these issues. Part 8. The path ahead. I will not tell you to vote or not vote. This article was a why instead of a what, but there are some strategies you can take to make whatever you choose viable. Firstly, for the voters, you must have leverage. If you have come this far and realized Yes, the system is unjust. You must understand that participation without leverage is compliance. It is akin to a worker going back to work while everyone else strikes. Compliance sustains the appearance of legitimacy. It tells the unjust system, people are still showing up anyway. It's working. If you vote unconditionally, because it's your duty, because not voting is irresponsible, you've removed your bargaining power and you have signaled that your participation is guaranteed no matter how little the system delivers for you, nor the people around you. Join a union, start a lobby group, leverage as much as you can, and then vote. Just don't be compliant to the system you claim is unequal. For the non-voters, it is imperative that you loudly proclaim why you aren't voting and use that as leverage. When workers strike together and make clear demands, non-participation becomes powerful, and when people collectively abstain from voting with articulated demands, e.g., no votes until we get such and such policy, it becomes a boycott, a refusal that signals power. Do not become a silent non-voter. Become a loud, organized boycotter. Whatever you do, do it with leverage.